Shall we start, Sukriti?
Yeah. 14 seconds to go now.
Oh, it says we are live. Okay. Good evening, everyone. At the very outset, let me thank the organizers of the Kalinga Lit Fest for providing the Writer in Context series with this space and platform for discussing the volumes. Sessions focusing on the series are to be held right through the month of March. And I have to say that while we planned these, the very easy manner in which the logistics fell into place has told us a lot about the efficiency and grace with which KLF works. Thank you once again, KLF. Of the Writer in Context series, 2 of the 11 volumes have been published, and we are meeting here today to talk about the first volume, Krishna Sobti, A Counter Archive. We have here with us today both the editors of the book, Sukrita Paul Kumar and Rekha Sethi. Sukrita is an eminent scholar, poet, and critic, and a former fellow of Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Simla, and has also held the prestigious Aruna Asaf Ali Chair at the University of Delhi. An honorary faculty at Corfu, Greece, she was an invited resident poet at the prestigious International Writing Program at Iowa, USA. Rekha Sethi is a professor, vice principal, and the coordinator of the Translation and Translation Studies Center at the Indraprasth College for Women, University of Delhi. She has authored 5 books, edited 8 books, and translated a collection of poetry from English to Hindi. She has also widely published in leading literary journals and presented her work at national and international fora. Uh, a very warm welcome to both of you, Sukrita and Rekha. Thank you for being here today. If shall we start?
Sure.
Yes, please.
The Writer in Context series plugs many existing gaps in the study and the teaching of Indian writings and writers, and provides the reader with a holistic picture of the socio-political, economic, and the personal realities that were contemporary to the writer. Sukrita, I'll come to you first. And would you like to tell us about how the idea of this series germinated? And are aware of your very close personal relationship with the writer in focus today, Krishna Sobti. For you, in that case, how did the dynamics between the objective and the subjective play out? Was it a fine balancing act, or did the narrative for the volume flow seamlessly? Over to you, Sukrita.
Yeah, thank you very much, KLF, and thank you, Vandana, for the introduction. I basically would like to introduce the idea of the series first, because I think each of the volumes that we are doing, of course, they stand in autonomy, but at the same time, there is a linkage between one and the other in terms of conceptualization of the series. And I think it's very important to focus a little bit on the series and see how these authors have come out of, or rather, they are in sync. The study of these authors is in sync with the concept of the series. And that is why this is happening. The first volume, which is Krishna Sobti. So we have to remember that all of the authors that we have chosen to work on, and with me, the series editor is Chandana Datta, who both of us have conceptualized this together. And we are happy that, Routledge also took upon itself to publish this as a series of nearly 12 books. So we are thankful to that as well. But I think it has been a matter of pure joy to see how, when literature in translation has got into, Indian literature in translation in particular, has got into the syllabi of a lot of English departments and South Asian centers all over the world and, of course, within the country. Now, English department, as we know, I mean, but to have a kind of a post-colonial approach to it, we know that we have been stuck in the colonial hangover for a very long time. And all these authors that we are talking about who have been brought into the English classroom, a classroom in the English department, the teaching, of course, is exciting. And we are very happy that we have come to historically that point when the translations are very actively happening of all these texts. But what about the critical material? What about the rooting of these writers in the tradition from where they come? And particularly in our multilingual context, and particularly in our diversity, cultural diversity from which each of the text comes from, I think it's very, not just the text, the writer who comes from that particular context of a culture, context of a point in history, context of his or her own personal life, and so on. So there isn't much material that is available in English on the writers that we end up teaching in the English classroom. So normally the text has to stand on its own. And that's not a very happy thing, because if it's a novel that comes out of a historical context of even 1857 or whatever aspect of history or the partition or any other, unless we know the entire political, historical, cultural context, it's difficult to place the text and the author and understand it. So for a comprehensive understanding of these authors, then a certain concept was worked out as to what we bring into each of the volumes, so that each of the volumes, if we are kind of well versed with the volume, with all the material in the volume, it feeds into the teaching of the author, teaching, learning, researching of the author in question. So the first thing was to decide as to which is the chunk of writers or the block of writers that we should pick up on. And we decided that we should be working on modern Indian writers, which means post-independence writers. So they all belong to a particular era, but they belong to different languages. And each language has its own context. So the point I'm making is that this is in a big way, in a macro style, this is the series concept as to how to provide material. This can actually go on for a very long time. So I'll cut it short by saying that the first author that we actually took upon was Krishna Sobti, and that was a volume that was already in the making, because, as you have rightly pointed out, I was very close to Krishna ji, and Krishna ji had herself been in the idea of the making of a volume like this. So we had been having debates for years on that, off and on. In between, there were many, many things that happened. But off and on, we would talk about this volume. And so she had started giving me material, piles of material on herself and on the things that she cherished. Whatever she cherished, she passed it on to me. I had quite a lot of material when I also thought when, I was approaching the publisher with the idea of, this idea of making the book started to crystallize with Krishna ji. She had only about a year to live, and so there wasn't much time to really for her to get into it. She wasn't feeling too well, so the book was lingering on and was not even half done. But I started then soon after that looking for a publisher for it, and it just so happened that talking to the publisher, the idea of the series evolved, and from the series, therefore, so many other books are coming out. But it also occurred to me that somebody like Rekha Sethi, who is a conscientious and sensitive critic, and belongs to the Department of Hindi, I thought I would get a lot of support in the context of Hindi literature person coming bang on with a person who's totally been into English and been working in English on Indian authors in different languages. So I think we teamed up pretty well, and we kind of modified the concept somewhat also from the earlier one. And well, that's how the work started. And there was no question of feeling how to bring the material onto the objective plane. One, that we were two of us working on this, so that also helped. But also, more importantly, I think I have had the chance of even working on my own father's works. So I have, somewhere trained myself to draw the line between what is personal and impersonal. And the personal feeds into the impersonal always. So I think in this case also, I felt enriched by the fact that I knew Krishna ji, and the material came out of that coming together of being a very interested reader on the one hand, and on the other hand, the relationship made me understand her better. So I think some of those inputs went into the making of the book as well.
Thank you, Sukrita. Rekha, my question is to you. The volume that you have co-edited is titled Krishna Sobti, A Counter Archive. An extremely interesting title, I might add, and one that immediately makes the reader curious to know what lies between the covers of this book and what might the book unravel. How would you connect this with Sopti's words where she says, "The romance of life is not in a straight line. Things would go stale if that were to happen." In this context, Rekha, how do you think Krishna Sopti herself might have reacted to this title, A Counter Archive?
Thank you, Vandana, and thank you, KLF, for giving us an opportunity to be on this forum. And I would thank Sukrita as well for making me a team member in this venture. Actually, the line you just now read out by Krishna Sobti itself explains the concept of counter archive. By counter archive, if I am to talk in a layman's language, we are trying to set off the dominant normative. So the term counter archive has been used in film studies, it has been used in architecture. So whatever is considered to be a dominant narrative, you always have to look at the history coming from below, something, an archive, which is the counter narrative. Also, it extends in the area of language, and also it has a perception that we are not just looking at the past in a different way, the way we are connecting to the present, and the way we have a perspective to look at the future. All these 3 points come together in Krishna Sopti's life and her work. Her life has been a life of a writer who resists. There have been many incidents where she showed her resistance to the establishment, to the authority, or the so called power structures. And in her writing, also, she is trying to build a history which is the counter history to the dominant words. And particularly, her whole ethos of her writing rests in the democratic values and in the in composite culture, particularly, she believes. So she's trying to bring all that alive in her writing. That is why it's a counter archive, I feel. And
And
I
Very
yes, yes.
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, Vandana, if I may add here, I think it's also what Rekha is saying is so true in terms of the life and works of Krishna Sobti. And she would have been absolutely thrilled with this title. I know that for a fact. And what I want to say is that she was actually right from day one. And, whenever she talked about herself, she also talked about how she defied a lot of, norms in the context of even being a child. So, what counter archive, I think, was a last minute decision that we had, Rick and I, that we should keep this as a title because one could see as to how, this is the irony. On the one hand, one is trying to place her in a tradition, and then we are saying it is counter archive. Now, it's in a way a contradiction, but a very beautiful contradiction. And I think it is in sync with what we are trying to do in the series, because while it is informing the tradition, it is actually, she's evolving out of a certain tradition, but in her evolution, she is interrogating the tradition. And so, in her works and in her life, you see the breaking of stereotypical notions and stereotypical characters and stereotypical usage of language, as Rekha rightly put it. So, all in all, you see how she's actually capturing and articulating silences, in life. And when you're looking at silences, I think it's an absolutely wonderful thing that she does of using language and juxtaposing it with silence in some particular text. We are not going into the details of it, but while speech was very important to her, sound was very important to her, and at the same time, she was juxtaposing it with, say, the silence between the lines or the incorporation of songs, for instance, which would only mean that they served also as kind of metaphors and of denial of linear narrative that she did not
Yes.
want in some cases. There was an absolute questioning of that. So counter archive, actually, if you really want us to talk about it, you've had it, because then we will spend at least 2 hours on that.
So that gives me my cue to move to the next part of this discussion.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Coming back to you, Sukrita, um, we know that the partition weighed very heavily on the consciousness of Krishna Sobti, and the scars that it left on her manifest themselves in a variety of ways, both in her fiction and in her non-fiction writings. She believed the difference between history and literature was that while one is governed by boundaries, the other flows freely across them. Um, and I'm going to cite two of her lines here. In one, in which she says, "If there is a Ayodhya there, if there is a Ayodhya, there is also a Faizabad." And in another instance, she says, "A Gujarat here and a Gujarat there." Both these lines to me speak volumes of her unwillingness to be restrained by political situations and by political developments. Sukrita, as you yourself have contributed so significantly to literary and critical work on partition, do you find yourself to be in sync with this line of thought?
Well, there is no doubt that her magnus opus, which she also regarded it as magnus opus, in as far as Zindagi Naa, her novel, is concerned. And again, ironically, when you start reading Zindagi Naa and you go through it till the end, there is no mention of partition, and it's actually the life story of a whole range of geographical area, vast area, wherein what she's really seeing is, what she's depicting is the composite culture of 1920s, and what has triggered off this novel in the post-partition era is the injury or the wounds that she suffered because of partition, psychological wounds that she suffered. And she wanted to take her pen and dig deep into what she called Zinda Rukh, that big tree of civilizational forces, which she wanted to see how, whether it is Bulle Shah or Baba Farid or, you know, Amir Khusro, and all of that, how were they coming together in terms of legends and myths and civilizational flow in the subcontinent? And so it's not a romanticized vision, but in a way a very realistic portrayal of that society. And it always reminds me of Kurutul and Heather's Aaka Darya, River of Fire, because this is what Kurutul and Heather also did. I mean, that big, huge novel that she wrote, what triggered off these novels, both the novels, what triggered off these novels was 1947 partition, and what personally the two authors or many other authors felt or suffered from. Now, from that, they are actually going into the past to retrieve that past in a way. The rupture that they witnessed, 1947 partition, came as a kind of a rude rupture to the civilizational forces of composite culture. And so what they were trying to do was to recreate in the case of Kurutul and Heather, she goes back to the 11th century and sees the flow of that civilizational force and river till the 20th century. But in the case of Krishna Sobti, she has taken up 1920s broadly, and the agrarian setup of how people lived together even when they belonged to different religions, different communities, and what kind of songs they were singing together, and what kind of composite culture could be drawn and painted at that. So it came out of that. So you're talking about partition, and the biggest novel in terms of the size and the range and the canvas, in as far as Krishna Sobti is concerned, is Zindagi Naa. But partition never had a closure, right? The sense of partition or the experience of partition as kept into the consciousness, subconsciousness of all these writers of this generation. So they kept going back to the partition experience and digging out metaphors from their creative imagination to project sometimes autobiographical features came in. So whether it is a novel like Gujarat here and Gujarat there, or it is Channa or any of the other novels, which refer to all the short stories that she wrote, Sikka Badal Gaya, they come out of partition consciousness at different points of time in her life. Because that's when the author is keeping on going back to that experience. It has had no closure. And why has it not had closure? We know that the political and the historical and the sociological context of our subcontinent, India, Pakistan, the divisive forces have been always at work. And these divisive forces, which became very communal, sharp and communal towards the end of the way partition happened. So what happened in 1971 and the communal riots that keep happening every few years in the subcontinent? Partition 1947 comes alive again and again and again. So partition 1947 is actually to be seen as a continuum. And that is why this continuum is dug into again and again by this generation of writers. And then eventually it goes on into post memory also. Like in the case of people like me, partition has been suffered actually by my parents, my father, but it has come to me as legacy. When I am writing on or researching on partition, my children will do it. So it is a ongoing thing for it's intergenerational that has been happening. So in the case of Krishna Sobti, her partition experiences, and she would actually cry, she would weep whenever she would talk about them. And that but the fact is that she's a successful artist in making the personal impersonal in her novels. And that is
Yes.
the beauty of a good artist, isn't it? So partition as a metaphor, partition has really lived, divisively in the way it happened. Partition as a phenomenon in history and partition as a personal phenomenon. They all come together here.
Yeah.
Yes, and if I may add to it a little, actually, her whole focus is not on the depiction of violence, but on the human connect, Yeah, and the compassion, the voices of compassion which she has interwoven in her narrative, that is also important, I think, in Krishna
Yeah,
Sobti's. That is what
interesting.
Sukrita has been pointing towards.
Yeah. Rekha, while you were talking about the other side of partition, I'd like to draw your attention to the range of people, if I may call them that, that we meet in Krishna Sopti's works, and the characters that stay in one's mind long after one has finished with one of her or any of her books are her women. She herself, we know, she was a decisive author. She had an amazing clarity of thought, and her women are also strong individuals. Their sexuality is often well defined, and they unhesitatingly even flaunt it. However, Krishna Sopti herself um, resents being identified or typified as a woman writer, and she's very clear about wanting to retain her autonomy as a writer, rising well above the gender-based identity as a writer. How do you think this reflects on her own ideas of feminism in her time?
Yes, actually, this is a very engaging question to which I would like to make 3 points on this. First, as you said, ki she's always resisted being called a woman writer because she thought calling herself a woman writer, she would be kind of restricted. And uh,
Yeah.
I found this very important. Like she says, writing is a complete culture in itself, and I'm proud to be a woman. But I cannot be merely termed as a woman writer because she says that when you talk about gender and language, we are so used to looking at the differences between men and women that we fail to look at the similarities between men and women. And as an author, there has to be some kind of a similarity in expressing the other person's experience as your own narrative. So, this at this one point, she says that an author crosses the boundaries of gender. That's why she would love to be called a writer with her full autonomy and not just as a woman writer. But why do feminist thinkers or critics always approach her writing, looking at her writing, at her women characters with a feminist lens? There are two, three special qualities, I think, if I look at the range of her characters, as you rightly pointed out. There is something very specific to geographical location. Like if you look at Zindagi Nama, there are so many diverse characters. Chachi Mehri, Rabia, Shahani, and and many more actually, if you look at it, because it's a kind of a cross section of the whole society, undivided Punjab. And
Mm.
then it is also important that when a woman speaks, what is the social position from where she is speaking? To give you an example, it's the Mehek Bano and Kutum Pyari in Dilo Danish. Both have a very different social position. So you have to look at this diversity. Her women characters are very, very diverse. Like Mitro Marjani, whom we always refer to whenever we are talking about the women characters, because she's the first person in Hindi literature who is talking about the autonomy of a woman on her own body. And if she identifies herself with her body or with her desire, she has an absolute authority about it, and she can take her own call. There is also a problem of the autonomous self and the familial situation. So this conflict is also present in Mitro Marjani and also in novels like A Ladki. But she has a finesse in her craft and narrative, because if you go to A Ladki after Mitro Marjani, or you make all these novels, I often refer to as Darse Bichri, Mitro Marjani, Surajmukhi Andhere Ke, Dilo Danish. All these women characters become a context for each other. All these stories are a context for each other. In A Ladki, it is not just the dialogue between two generations, but Krishna Sobti kind of elevates the whole dialogue to a philosophical position, because it in Dar Se Bichhdi, the cover page has a line, एक बार का थिर का पैर जिंदगानी धूल में मिला सकता है, एंड ए लड़की हैज अ लाइन, अपने में होना ही परम है. So she has defined the ultimate for a woman, to be your own self. But what is really striking in these diverse women characters is that all of these women have an authority about their own self. And this authority does not originate from any theoretical position. Krishnaji is not writing a feminist text to endorse a theoretical paradigm, or to kind of trying to fit into a typical paradigm, but uh, all our characters are throbbing with life. They originate, and look at the variety of the geographical location also. Like if Zindagi Nama is placed in undivided Punjab, Mitro is placed in Punjab and Rajasthan, Surajmukhi Andhere Ke is placed between Delhi and Shimla, Dilo Danish in Delhi, A Ladki again in Delhi, but talking about Shimla again and again, and also to the beautiful places the mother visited. Like there is a scene from Kolkata, the banks of the Ganga River, and where she went boating and where she went trekking. All these such things come together. So I personally feel that though Krishna ji may have always denied the, the this kind of a label of being a woman writer, but she had something in her characters so that we all look towards her as a feminist icon, or maybe a kind of a liberal, uh, which where gender polarities actually seem to be dissolving, and the women have a different kind of an autonomy.
Sukrita, just taking forward what Rekha has said, and talking of Sukti's women characters and her own very strong belief in bringing women forward. This makes me think of her fascination with the idea of an androgynous self, Ardhanarishwar, if you please. Would you say that this is a conflict of sorts with her desire and effort to bring women to the forefront? Or would you say that this is also it's another form of dilution of tangible boundaries of any kind? I mean, in this case, emanating from gender profiling. Would you say that this is also a
I personally would like to do not agree with you at all, even the way you have posited the question, because Krishnaji's writing is all around. It's not a question of, we have to be very careful when we use the word foregrounding. It was not her aim to foreground any one character, but to just get under the skin of that character. And of course, predominantly there are women characters, but in what about Yaro Ke Yar, for instance, her idea was to basically um, not be conscious, but just be picking up characters who are vibrant and history from below kind of thing, right? Now, Mitro Marjani is an ordinary woman who is obsessed with the body, right? So it's a story about female desire, and it's a tabooed area. It's a totally tabooed area in as far as in not just Hindi writing, but generally in this subcontinent. Very few people, very few writers, at the time when she was writing, would pick up this whole notion of female desire, or body to be in the center, or sexuality, female sexuality. So she was picking up, as I think Rekha rightly pointed out, women who were throbbing with, ideas and wanted to live in their own autonomy. I would not use, Rekha, the word authority there. I would use the word autonomy. Autonomy is what they wanted, each one of them, In the case of even mother and daughter in LRD, you see that, it is autonomy of both the daughter as daughter of the next generation and the mother as the mother who has got experiential wisdom of a certain kind, which is translated into a philosophic kind of a dialogue between the two of them. Now, the point that you asked me, let me just come to that also. The point is that, see, about androgyny, she was very conscious of, rightly, you're talking about, binaries, for instance, not go into the binaries so much, particularly when she's consciously writing on live characters and live, what was she doing? She became an androgynous self, particularly in her volume called Hum Hashmat. And in Hum Hashmat, 4 volumes of Hum Hashmat, not no small thing, And the last volume was published just about a couple of years before she passed away at 90, right? And what was she doing? She said, as I sit on my table, writing table, on the other side, there is Hashmat sitting all the time. And in fact, in one of the pieces, she writes Hashmat, Hashmat se. They're dialoguing with each other, also as a Hashmat.
Mulakat Hashmat se.
Yeah. So that mulakat with Hashmat is actually revealing quite a lot. That is one. But the more important thing is, she says, when I would sit down to do Hum Hashmat pieces, they would खाका बोलते हैं, उर्दू हिंदी में उसको खाका बोलते हैं. जब ये खाका लिखती थी, portraits or sketches of either an occasion or characters, she would become a male voice to do that. Now, what was her purpose? She just wanted to go beyond her gender. That's it. In those specific, it was going beyond, getting under the skin of not the woman that she was, but to become a man to be able to write in order to get away from the woman. She was not looking really for similarities between men and women, but the complementarity is what she talks about, between the two. And I think it's very important to see these nuances the way they come in these texts. And therefore, for feminist critics to be able to look at that, I think it's very important. Because her feminism is her own kind of feminism, where she's breaking all the rules also. Sexuality, female sexuality, desire, woman's body, all of this becomes very important. So androgyny, when she practices androgyny, is at the time, and very consciously, because that's the one thing that she talked about. She was not talking about feminism theoretically at any other point, except to say, look, don't categorize me as a woman writer. Don't put me into the category of a woman writer, because I am not bound by that. Right? Now, one more thing before I stop. One more thing, and that is when she said, when she would pick up her pen as Hashmat, even the style of picking up the pen and her handwriting would change. Her pen, the holding of the pen would change. And she says, I thought differently also. And it helped me to get in the character of Hashmat in order to, as I said, escape my womanly self. I didn't want to do it as a woman, So that is how she brought in that element. And often did we discuss with her, I have discussed with her androgyny, the concept of androgyny of Virginia Woolf, Because Virginia Woolf was doing that in the early 20th century herself, talking about it. And in fact, it tied up with my PhD thesis, which was towards the ideal of androgyny, which I did. Anyway, it's a huge area again, and we have, if Rekha would vouch for it, if we start talking about it, we can go to the essays that we have incorporated. And this is an opportunity, Rekha, perhaps we can show off our book.
Yes,
this, yeah. So this is the South Asian edition of the book which Routledge has brought out. This is Krishna Sobti counter archive, and this is the edition that was brought out before. This is the UK edition. So I think people will have to dig into it to realize how much it's a collective. It's a collective. It's not. Yes, it's an editorial vision, that is, our editorial vision goes into it. But there are more than 15 people, 20 people who have contributed to this. And we have made those selections out of hundreds of writings in Hindi, which we actually sifted and translated, got it translated. So it is a book that in a holistic way, comprehensive way, that we are trying to present Krishna Sobti, and hopefully this will trigger off other ideas and more books will come out because of this.
I don't think any discussion about Krishna Sobti can be complete without touching upon her language and her absolutely fascinating use of words. And it might interest some of our viewers, and therefore I'm tempted to quote her here. Uh, she says, "Your language is not merely the one you have been taught with linguistic skills and grammar. It comprises also of what you have experienced and imbibed in life, as well as what your concerns are. It is not the vocabulary, but the deeper sense of words. Before writing on paper, one has to create a pool culture, recognizing ethnicity, linguistic outfit, and the class of characters." Uh, Sukrita, would you like to comment on this, and would you like to? I mean, clearly, these are words of a free spirit,
Yeah.
and these are words of somebody who is absolutely not. She did not ever allow herself to be bound down by traditional language structures, or to be governed by the do's and don'ts of accepted forms of expression. Any discussions that you might have had with her about this? She may have talked about this, what how she uses language, or your own thoughts on her use of language.
Yeah, see, this is a very, I mean, lots and lots of people in Hindi know this, and even in English. Krishnaji's use of Hindi language is different in each of her novels.
Yeah.
If she is writing Hindi, of course, all her works were in Hindi. But then we say it is many Hindis that you see in her.
Yes.
Because when she's writing Mitro Marjani, there is Rajasthani, Punjabi,
Yeah.
Hindi, all these inflections are coming through. The language is very powerful in each case. In each of the novels, the language is very, very powerful because the freedom that she has exercised it with a lot of sense of responsibility. Now, what is this sense of responsibility? The sense of responsibility comes to the fact that the words that she puts into the mouth of a character have to be authentic. And so for that, the geographical location becomes important. If it is an area of Gujarat, Pakistan and Gujarat, Hindustan, that kind of, the language would vary from that novel to the novel of, say, something like Dilo Danish. Dilo Danish would immediately take you to Old Delhi. The language tells you that. Language in itself is actually giving you the geographical context. Now, our problem, Rekha, if you remember, was what do we do if we are talking about this in translation? Because English is a leveler, right? It sort of bulldozes everything to standardization. So if you are looking at the translated text, you're not going to be able to get to understand what is the language that Krishnaji used in that particular novel. So that is why in the book we decided we should have some translators to contribute in the context of what problematics they literally suffered when they were translating Krishnaji. So you have to have that power, similar power of creativity, which Krishnaji had with Hindi. You needed to have that kind of flair for language in English to be able to not what in ordinary language will be called abuse English language, but you are actually playing with language.
Yeah.
And that is what made language, I think she was playing with language. She was highly creative. We all know that. Whether it was, I referred to this story earlier, Yaro Ke Yar, where it is men's office, people were abusing each other. And of course, whether, or if you go to Channa, for instance, her first novel, Channa, it is so deplorable that it was people were editing those other words out of the novel. Other meaning non-Hindi, they thought it was non-Hindi. So
Yeah.
therefore, they were trying to level it out in Hindi. And so, what did she do? Do you think she was an embodiment of counter archive? Would she do that? Would she accept that? She went and bought all the copies of the edited Channa novel, and she created a bonfire and burnt them all, and put the original manuscript in a trunk. And that was her first novel, which got published as the last novel towards the end of her life. That is the kind of person she was. So why was it? Because there was always, and she was obviously highly laudable in terms of use of language and all that. But she had people like Phanishwarnath Renu and Rahi Basum Raza, who were also playing with language, who were also creating a new idiom. And she always referred to them as her ideals. She kept saying, look, they have done it. That is how a novel is written. But there was a whole, lot of critics in Hindi who were resisting that kind of usage of language, because all the pundits in every language, all pundits of all languages would want pure language, but a writer always adulterates it creatively, and that's the beauty of the writer, right?
Actually,
Really like your
Sabi,
comments on, sorry.
yeah,
Yes, I was coming to you. I would also like you to tell us a little bit about, I mean, you yourself flow so freely between Hindi and English. And what was the process by which translations were included in this volume? And what were the challenges that you faced as an editor, and of course, what were the challenges that the translators faced, those who have contributed to this particular volume?
actually, in this volume, we have two essays, one by Neer Kamal Mani and one by Daisy Rockwell, who are talking about their experiences of translating the text. And I really like the line Daisy Rockwell uses, that Krishna Sobti is writing to reveal. So that is, and one of the titles of her book is Shabdon ke Alok mein. And a widely quoted line in that book and other places as well is, every word has a body, a soul, and an attire. I think nobody has ever
Yes.
referred to uh, words having an attire. And
Yeah.
actually, Sukrita has highlighted about the diverse Hindis and other qualities of the language which Krishna Sobti brings in. But there is something very striking which I realized just today, like while I was thinking about the language Krishna Sobti is using. It is about the use of putting something into words which can be felt through senses. Like if you look at various novels, you will find various instances where she's talking about the taste of the food.
Yeah.
She's talking about the images, like if she's going on a trek, then the way she looks at the hills or the mountains or the river or the then uh, when she's talking about a relationship, I always admire that piece where she's talking about the sexual act and she's looking at it as an altar of devotion or worship. So the kind of how one feels and experience through the senses, and that sensuousness, to bring it into words, I think it's a tough task for any author of any language, and that she has been able to do. And she calls it like trying to find light in a word, or adding light to the word. That is what she has been doing, and that is what she says, it has an attire. A word has an attire, not just body and soul. And also, I think she's always connecting her inner mind to the external reality, and negotiating the language between the two. And of course, Sukrita has earlier mentioned the use of her silences, where she
Yeah.
doesn't say in as many words. Particularly striking is the last scene of Sikka Badal Gaya, where Shahani is wishing well for everyone, and this keeps echoing the line, the Sikka Badal Gaya keeps echoing, translating. Of course, now I remember that the translator of the story did not translate the title because he thought it is untranslatable. So
Yes.
all this has happened, and I was particularly amazed because the way she writes about the in Mitro Marjani, the or Yaro Ke Yaar, the expletives she uses, and how to translate that. But I think in many of the volumes I found that translators have done a magnificent job. Actually, they have to a great extent lived up to, they have created that kind of flavor in the English, and that is not very anglicized English, but a particular tone they have maintained in their translations, which gives us an insight into the style of Krishna Sobti. This is very important, the original text. But of course we did struggle with the critical essays which were being translated, because at times the translator doing it in English would not understand the context in Hindi, the context of the critical writing in Hindi. And at that time, I think myself and Sukrita, we spent hours reading it out and matching with the original. That was a big challenge for us.
My last and final question is to both of you, and it is to do with the series. Um, how as editors of this particular volume, and Sukrita, you as the series editor of the you and Chandana Datta. How does the series represent the shift, or shall we say, the inclusion of culture studies as a significant area in contemporary academics? The manner in which culture studies and literature have gotten woven together. How does the writer in context piece present itself, both one as a representative of, and two as an outcome of cultural diversity, linguistic pluralities, and traditions?
Indeed, I mean, the fact that writer in context is dealing with writers from different languages, that in itself, I think, speaks for a certain kind of diversity in terms of cultural context in India. But I think what is even significant, to even more significant right now, is to think of the cross currents as well between one language and another. Long ago, Sujit Mukherjee had used this term transregionality. And I think that transregionality is very important to at least look at. We won't go into details, but how one flows into the other, and yet there is a distinct stream as well, within that particular language, while there would be influences from other neighborly languages, etc. But another important thing that I think we need to take account of in our context, and particularly of the writer like Krishna Sobti, And I mentioned this earlier, the sounds, right? Now, in her case, particularly in fiction writing, but even otherwise, there's a dialectic that one has to notice between the written and the spoken, the written and the oral. And I think a fiction writer is quite conscious of this when you're portraying particularly characters. And so, not just that, but also oral traditions, the way they flow into Krishnaji's Zindagi Naa, for instance, I mentioned this, that there are songs that come in. Bulle Shah's song comes in several times. And so that element is strong. The sensuousness of it also is very important. What are the sounds? And that is why in the process of translation, at least I'm very conscious that we need to retain some sounds in English as well, retain the sound quality so that culture is not totally lost out, because it goes into, and that is why when you're looking at culture studies as well, we are also diving into what are the perspectives, what is the worldview, so where do they get knitted in, where do they divert. Now in the context of sexual politics, you can actually see sexual politics and cultural manifestation of that in Krishnaji's several novels, right? So you obviously, when you do fine combing with this different cultural precepts in mind, if you do fine combing of a text, you do see that you begin to understand this writer representing something in this unique way and another writer doing it in another unique way. So diversity within, of course, cultures, but diversity also between one kind of writer and another kind of writer. So it's very interesting to see how, while there is diversity, there is also a stream of crossing one over the other or into the other. So transregionality also becomes important. So I think, and another point, and then I'll stop, multilinguality within the same writer's consciousness, which is demonstrated in Krishna Sobti so well. When I said, Rajasthani comes into her Hindi, or in Punjabi comes into it, so you see another kind of multilinguality operative, because she is throwing away the standardization of Hindi. So, that a culture studies person would have different lens to use for this purpose, and come to conclusions about what India is all about eventually, after going through all the 11 or 12 books that we are doing. I think a lot of India would come alive, the diversity, the plurality, and all the things.
Yeah. Rekha, would you like to quickly add something to what Sukrita has said?
No, actually, Sukrita has almost covered everything. What I want to say is that it has been quite a satisfying experience for us working on this book, because this way we have also discovered. Krishnaji says about her characters that she is a discovery and a challenge too. So we have also discovered Krishnaji and her diversity, and particularly the culture we get from her, how we locate her in, is very, very vibrant, and it's not something that is raised on a pedestal, but it comes alive through the great tree of life, as she calls it.
Thank you, Rekha. I think with that, we will need to now bring this discussion to a close, much as we can go on forever, as Sukrita said, about various aspects of Krishna Sobti's writing and about this particular volume. So thank you very much once again, Sukrita Paul Kumar and Rekha Sethi. And once again, my thanks goes out to the Kalinga Lit Fest for giving us this opportunity. Thank you once again, KLF. We will close with that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kalinga Litfest. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity to actually do a post-mortem also of what we have done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.